The early 2000s were such an interesting time for movies, especially superhero movies. So today I wanted to rank the 19 different Marvel movies that came out between 2000 and 2009. I hope you enjoy, and here we go. At number 19, in dead last, I have the Hulk. This was terrible, and even worse, it was boring. This was the first time I'd seen it, and I hated it. I thought the actor that played the Hulk was bad. I thought the Hulk itself looked awful, and I had to keep myself from falling asleep the whole time. As of writing this, I have 2 more movies to watch for this ranking, and I'll be genuinely amazed if this doesn't end up last. I can't even explain how bad and weird the editing was. Sometimes there was 4 shots of different squares on the screen, and it was garbage. The Incredible Hulk that came out a few years later wasn't great, but it makes this movie look like actual trash. Not to mention the weird Hulk dogs that were there for one scene and his lackluster fight with his dad at the end, it just wasn't great. I thought the whole storyline with his dad was just so stupid. One of the very few things I liked about this movie was Sam Elliott playing Ross. I thought that was really good, and he definitely looked the part. But that's all I could even think of for things I liked about it. Bad movie, I will never watch it again. At number 18, I have X-Men Origins Wolverine. I really hate this movie. The only reason it's not in dead last is because of how boring the Hulk was. Like, they made Deadpool not able to speak, and it just made the character awful. Even with Ryan Reynolds, who I admit was very good as Deadpool, eventually, they whiffed it. They also made a Wolverine movie silly and just not good. I think the beginning with all the different characters and them becoming a task force kind of was dumb. I just hate how much the movie sucked compared to the future Wolverine movies, especially Logan. I like Sabretooth and his dynamic, I guess, but it was just so poorly done. I thought it was silly when Wolverine and his wife, they fake her death, and it's just so stupid. Lastly, the final fight against Deadpool and then the reveal that he survived just pissed me off. I wish I had more to complain about, but I just don't even know what else to say. Might hate watch it again eventually. At number 17, I have Elektra. So this movie was so forgettable, I actually had to rewatch it for the rankings. It's so bad. It's boring, silly, and just overall meh. The action should be cool, at the very least, but it wasn't. The tattoo and the final fight, they just weren't cool. And I love Jennifer Gardner and things like 13 Going on 30 and Alias, but this just wasn't the role for her. This has the unfortunate early 2000s trend of just hiring famous people, even if they don't seem right for the role. And this seems like an unofficial Daredevil sequel, which is weird because I don't know if they even mention Matt once, which is crazy. I hope I never watch it again because it was just as bad as I remembered it. Also, the soundtrack sucked compared to Daredevil's because Evanescence was so dang good in that movie. I'll talk about that later. I can't think of anything else to complain about with this movie. You just really should not watch it. At number 16, I have The Punisher Warzone. I just finished this movie less than a minute ago as of writing. It was silly and goofy. I'd put it right next to Elektra, which works out because that's where I ranked it. I like that this Punisher was more brutal and broken than the other Punisher on this list, but I still don't think he was good. I think this Punisher actor, I don't know, he just wasn't right. I think this movie has better actors, but worse acting, and if that makes sense. I like seeing McNulty from The Wire, but after he got scarred and stuff, he just became so campy and silly, it took me out of the story. I liked Wayne Knight in it, though. I always think of him as Newman, but he was really good in this. The biggest reason why this is going to be lower than the other Punisher was that the inconsistent tone throughout just kind of threw me off. The villains were cartoonish, but whenever Frank was on screen, it became a super serious movie. I wish it would have gone one route or the other. It just was not great. The violence was over the top, which is about right for a Punisher movie, but the movie altogether just isn't very good. At number 15, I have Blade Trinity. I'm so glad I didn't hate this movie as much as I thought I would. I thought it was going to be like competing with the Hulk for the bottom spot from what I'd heard from people, but it wasn't that bad. That being said, it wasn't good. It's hard not to compare it to the other two movies that came before it. I liked Blade and I liked Blade 2 even more, but two things this movie didn't need were Ryan Reynolds and Dracula. And Ryan was being too much of Ryan Reynolds, if that makes sense. He's a little too Ryan Reynoldsy in this. I'm over the obsession with Ryan Reynolds. I thought it was funny that Dracula goes by Drake now and was apparently there for the crucifixion of Jesus, which is a wild lore drop. This movie finally became the goofy early 2000s movie that I first expected with all of them. It started to go down a cool route with the humans going after him for his crimes, but it quickly dropped the idea for Dracula, which sucked. It also had vampire dogs in it, which were almost as stupid as the Hulk dogs. As always, Blade was awesome, but the movie around him just wasn't up to par with the other two. But after seeing the trilogy, I'm excited for them to eventually reboot it, hopefully. At number 14, I have The Punisher. I just watched this for the first time, so I want to get my fresh opinions out. This movie was okay. The worst thing that could have happened to it was the show coming out and showing how much better The Punisher could be. Because before this, I'd never seen a Punisher movie. It was 2000s corny, but not terrible in that way. I didn't like the guy who played Frank very much. He didn't ever seem angry or broken. He's just there, which is crazy. He watched his family die. A lot of the time, he acted more like a secret agent than a vigilante, and that was just weird. The action was okay, but like I said, with both the Punisher and Daredevil shows, we've seen how cool and brutal this character can be, and this just isn't it. I liked his apartment friends, and I liked how he handled some of the people that screwed him over. I thought it was very cool that he put his own headstone on the bad guy's golf course. I thought that was pretty sick. The villains were forgettable, and the movie lost a few points because of how much I hate John Travolta. He sucks. Altogether, it was an okay movie, but definitely not memorable. I probably will never watch it again. At number 13, I have X-Men: The Last Stand. This movie, above everything else, is just a disappointment. It was so exciting for me to finally see an X-Men movie when I was old enough to get it as it came out. I loved X2 and was really excited to see how they finished the trilogy. But what we got instead was a few movies rolled into one, and a huge comic event like the Phoenix Saga just rushed through. That should have been its own trilogy, but it's not. It's mixed in with the idea of the Cure and the mutant war that Magneto rages. What really stinks is most of the characters in it are still pretty good. Ian McKellen is great as always. Magneto is the GOAT of this series, him and Wolverine. I also think that Beast and Storm are pretty good as well. But they kill Cyclops pretty fast, along with Professor X, which sucks. I just wish they spaced these stories out into at least 2 movies. I think this could have been a very interesting story, but it was wasted. That's why the movie disappointed me so much. It could have been so much better if they took the time that it deserved. But since it wasn't great, the trilogy did not stick the landing, and I rarely watch this movie. At number 12, I have Fantastic Four: Rise of the Silver Surfer. It's so interesting looking back at movies from this time. They always seem to jump the gun a bit, and this movie is one of the best examples. They had one of the biggest, baddest villains in Marvel, Galactus, and put him in their second movie, which is crazy to think about now. Not only that, they butchered the character. For some reason, they made him a giant smoke monster alien, and it was so dumb. Galactus and the Silver Surfer could have been so cool, but they literally had the Silver Surfer go up and kill Galactus in like 2 minutes once he started. I did like seeing Captain Holt in the movie, R.I.P., but it just, I don't know. I think the only character that gets some real arc in it was Johnny. Him learning to be less selfish and that maybe he wants to settle down. I thought that was cool. Reed disappointed me though because he didn't really learn his lesson. He was distracted with his wedding. He couldn't spend one day on his wedding, and then the movie made it seem like he was right. And that, I don't know, that felt really unfair to Sue. Doom coming back, kind of felt lackluster because he didn't ever seem to be any kind of threat at all this time. Overall, this was just a worse version of the original movie, and the original wasn't very good anyways. At number 11, I have Ghost Rider. This was a movie I liked way more than I should have growing up. It was silly and fun and seemingly very comic accurate. It doesn't hurt that Nick Cage is my favorite actor and he gets to be pretty crazy in this movie. I like the beginning flashback showing how everything came to be. Everything from the deal to his powers to Roxanne just made sense. And she was great in the movie too. Not crazy memorable or anything, but she did a good job. I liked it showing Johnny testing the limits of humanity by doing like crazier and crazier stunts. I can't imagine watching someone jump a football field with moving helicopters in it. That's just insane. Sam Elliott was a cool addition as well as the mentor and former Ghost Rider himself. The bad guys were pretty lame to me though. I don't know. They kind of reminded me of the villains in Elektra, and that's not a good thing. All in all, this movie, I don't know. You'll probably like it if you like Nick Cage, and you probably won't if you do not like him or his movies. At number 10, I have Spider-Man 3. I know this movie isn't very good, but I always have a good time watching it. I think Tobey is good as Peter, and I really enjoyed Emo Peter during it too. I can tell he really enjoyed doing that part, and it's still famous for all the memes it's created to this day. Him dancing in the streets or at MJ's diner was just silly and fantastic. The biggest problem this movie had was the amount of villains in it. Sandman, Venom, and Hobgoblin was just a little too much. I think if they were to cut one for story's sake, it would have to be Sandman, which sucks because he's actually my favorite villain in the movie. There just wasn't space for him. I think that Harry was an idiot. Like, clearly Peter didn't kill your evil dad, but he didn't listen. Venom was cool, mostly because we got to see like how the symbiote affected Peter, and eventually how it affected Eddie Brock and how they were different. It added a layer to the story. I wish this movie was split into two movies. I actually think that the original plan was to do that, but there was studio interference, so that sucks. But this movie is the worst of the original Spider-Man trilogy, but it's still better than like any Amazing Spider-Man in my opinion. I don't know. Definitely worth a watch just for how funny it is. At number 9, I have Fantastic Four. This was very possibly one of the first 3 superhero movies I ever saw as a kid, and I remember it feeling like a comic book. They all looked so much like they were supposed to in their costumes, it just looked perfect. Still to this day, I think Reed Richards looked exactly like the actor. Like, I think he was perfect to play him. And that's, I don't know, that's really cool. I really like the space scene where they and Doom first get their powers. It was quick, straight to the point. We don't want to see just random 4 people. We want to see the Fantastic Four. It was crazy to me years later seeing Chris Evans play Captain America because I remember his egotistical Johnny Storm. One of my big problems with this movie is what I mentioned during the ranking of the Rise of the Silver Surfer. They had no sense of scale in their universe. Their first movie was to take on Doctor Doom, who is one of Marvel in general's biggest and most powerful bad guys ever. I wish they would have paced themselves a little bit, but thankfully the MCU started to do that eventually. Imagine if the first Thor, he fought Gore the God Butcher and then Thanos in the second one. Altogether, not a bad movie, just about right for the 2000s era. At number 8, I have Blade 2. Before yesterday, I had never seen any of the Blade movies. Blade 1 wasn't on this list because it was made in the 90s, but I watched it to understand the other two. I just finished Blade 2 and it was really good. I even like it more than the first one. The action was great, the little bit of humor was fun, and it was a natural progression from the first one. I really like the villains of this one. It wasn't just vampires, they were super vampires that were hard to kill, and I thought that was fun. I also liked the twist at the end that everyone probably saw coming, but it was still well done. This was such an early 2000s movie in the best way. I like seeing Blade work with the vampires that he'd usually be hunting. The love interest was also good, not too over the top, they just flirted a little bit, and that was cool. I just like these movies, and from what I've heard, Blade Trinity is going to be a tough watch, so I'm hoping it's at least okay. And now future me can say it was okay. But I'm glad I finally got to watch Blade 1, 2, and eventually 3. This one is easily a top 10 2000s Marvel movie. At number 7, I have X-Men. This was a pretty cool movie. I love seeing all the characters from the TV show and comics come to life. One of the best movie antagonists ever, in my opinion, is Magneto, and I thought Ian McKellen was very, very good in that part. I thought Wolverine was also great. Hugh Jackman was a stellar choice, even though he wasn't a movie star yet, and they got lucky. And Patrick Stewart was a perfect person to go up against Ian as Charles Xavier. This, oddly enough, was not the first X-Men movie I saw as a kid. I saw X2 many times before I saw the original, and it made this movie a little bit worse for me, unfortunately. I'll talk about X2 in a few minutes, but it is a much better movie in my opinion, which drags this one down just a little bit. Though Magneto was cool, the side villains weren't great. Toad, Sabretooth, and even Mystique weren't nearly as cool or threatening as they could have been in this. My favorite bit in these movies is Wolverine, who is a metal skeleton going up against Magneto, who controls metal, and he just always tosses him. That always cracks me up. But this isn't a bad movie, just definitely not the best of the trilogy. At number 6, I have The Incredible Hulk. This was the second MCU movie, and it was interesting. I loved how the Hulk looked in this, especially now that I can compare it to how bad it looked in 2003. I really liked the beginning when he was working at the plant and accidentally got Stan Lee killed. And though I came to love Mark Ruffalo as the Hulk, I was really upset when I originally heard that Edward Norton was getting replaced. I thought he was really good, and looking back, he was okay. He had the benefit of not having to be on screen all the time because of CGI. Took care of a lot of that while he was the Hulk. This was just right at the beginning of a new age when it and Iron Man came out, and they were taking Marvel movies seriously, and I don't know, being careful about what they put out as their brand. They weren't just throwing out a random Punisher movie, which was great. Gone were the days of these terrible sequels because now they had a plan. It wasn't perfect, obviously. They had this come out a little over a month after Iron Man, which is really crazy to think about. But this was the start of a new age of comic book movies that weren't Batman, and I was so happy to see it. This was an alright movie, and I come back to it every once in a while. At number 5, I have Daredevil. I will admit it, this ranking is carried by nostalgia. I realize this movie isn't everyone's cup of tea, but when I tell you that me and my brothers watched this movie a ton as a kid, you better believe it. Even to this day, I know all the words to some Evanescence songs just because of how hard it rocked in the movie. Everything from the action to the leather suit to him basically having superpowers jumping 30 feet in the air made this movie so memorable to me. Not only that, but Daredevil is my favorite MCU hero, Marvel hero in general. I'm currently watching Daredevil Born Again, which you should too if you haven't seen it. And it's just reminding me of how much I liked this movie. I thought Bullseye was so cool, and Kingpin was even cooler. I loved how he could pretty much see when it was raining, and I loved the silly park fight he had with Elektra. This movie was just such a perfect time capsule for 2004. My biggest gripe with it, oddly enough, was that I wish he did more lawyer stuff like he does in the show. I'm definitely rewatching this soon. At number 4, I have X-Men 2, or X2. Now for my favorite of the trilogy. X2 goes so hard. From the very beginning, where we see Charles freeze everyone's mind, to the very end, it was just amazing. Even cooler was the scene right before it with Nightcrawler in the White House. That was one of the greatest scenes I've ever seen. I loved him using his powers to the extent that, he should be able to. And he's one of the coolest mutants, so I'm glad he got to be like that. Then there's the scene with Wolverine while he's babysitting, and he had to go fight all the bad guys breaking into the mansion. This is what X-Men movies should be like. No cheesy lines, just every character using their powers to the extent that they can, and just to be as cool as possible. Mystique was so much better in this one, and even Magneto got cooler somehow. I like seeing them all work together against Stryker. Speaking of Stryker, he was a great villain in this. His mind control was awesome, and I like seeing him and his son just kind of take on Charles. I thought that was very interesting. I really liked Jean's sacrifice at the end, and seeing how powerful she became. Wolverine fighting Lady Deathstrike was also fun and an entertaining fight. But my favorite scene in the whole movie was Magneto escaping jail. It was so cool watching him pull the metal out of the guard's body. This was even cooler to me than the Nightcrawler one because I loved to see how he used his powers. I forgot how much I like this movie and I need to rewatch it soon. At number 3, I have the original Spider-Man. This is the perfect origin story that so many movies have tried to replicate since. Everything from how he gets bit to him designing his costume to Uncle Ben dying in his arms felt like it was ripped right out of the pages of a comic book. Green Goblin was the perfect villain for him, and Willem Dafoe did a fantastic job in the role. I don't really have any complaints about this movie. Maybe one is that Tobey was a really good Peter, but I always found him a little silly as Spider-Man. And though he is now an alleged piece of shit, James Franco was pretty good as Harry Osborn, I'll admit. I feel like they casted really well from Mary Jane to Aunt May and everyone in between. I love the music in this, and the story felt like it made sense. This is one of the most iconic superhero movies of my childhood, and that's crazy to me because it isn't even the best Spider-Man on this list. But this is a great origin film, and it set the bar pretty high for all those that came after it.
I am Iron Man.
At number 2, I have Iron Man. Iron Man is an iconic movie. If it didn't work as well as it did, I don't think the MCU would have ever came into being. But it did work, and that's largely because they gave Robert Downey Jr. a chance. He'd gotten in trouble with drugs in the 2000s, and it seemed like his career was going to die, but then he became Tony Stark. He is one of the best casted superheroes in history, in my opinion. He was perfect for the role. He embodied exactly what Tony Stark was, and that made the movie work. I love seeing his origin and how he had a huge character arc just in the beginning of the movie alone. He was so selfish, he didn't care about anyone or that he was making weapons that killed people. But then after he was attacked, he changed. He came out of that cave like a new man, and he had a new goal. The cast is very good in this. The one actor I didn't really like in the role was Terrence Howard as Rhodey, and they changed that, so it didn't matter. This movie had to be good to jumpstart the MCU, and it did not disappoint. My biggest problem with it is that one that I have with a lot of MCU movies, the villain's lame. I really liked him as the evil businessman, but I wasn't a fan of a bigger Iron Man fighting Tony. I thought that was silly. That being said, this is one of my favorite superhero movies ever. And finally, at number 1, I have Spider-Man 2. Last, but certainly not least, is Spider-Man 2. This is the only early 2000s movie that is in contention as one of the best comic book movies ever, in my opinion. The story's about Spider-Man, this guy with superpowers, yet it feels so human. Everything is going wrong for Peter. Harry, his best friend, hates him because he thinks he killed his dad. He stays away from Mary Jane because he's worried she'll get hurt if she gets close to him. And every time he tries to get close to her, the crime fighting gets in the way. He's making almost no money because the Daily Bugle pays poorly. He can barely pay rent for his tiny apartment, and he's starting to do poorly in his classes because he's so tired from being Spider-Man all the time. All of his problems in his mind go back to the pressure of being Spider-Man. And midway through the movie, his mind finally snaps and he can't use his powers anymore. And all seems good. His life improves drastically with all of the things I described. And he just has to go back to it because he knows he's the one that has to save the day. And I think that's pretty amazing. Now pair that with one of the greatest villains of any comic book movie ever. Doc Ock is so good in it. I love seeing his origins of his power and how he used to be such a good man. But the same accident that took his wife from him gave him the metal arms. The train scene with him and Peter is so iconic and probably the most memorable part of the movie. And then Octavius finally seeing what he's become at the end of the movie and saving the city by drowning his machine was just beautiful. Spider-Man didn't save the day by punching him. He saved the day by talking to Doc Ock and showing him the error of his ways. This movie is truly amazing and easily the best one to come out of the early 2000s. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Please comment below what I should rank next and have a fantastic day.